Bristol cars built in the UK had the greatest anti-rust system built into it, usually by oil leaks all over the car, washing back underneath. But every time you took your car out of the garage, you probably found there was 3 leaks near the back end. One right over the diff area and one each side on your rear suspension unit. It's all controlled by rubber gaiters or bushers or seals, and to do it properly you really got to go ahead and do it 100% because the way it's built is quite complex. But we'll take for a start the ball joint on the A bracket. That's part here. The A bracket runs from here back to mounting points on the chassis, and this sits on top of the diff on the crown wheel carrier assembly. To work on this one, it's quite simple. First you jack up the car, you drain all the oil out of the diff, you take the wheels off the car, you then turn around and take the backing plate of the axles out of the car, you disconnect the tail shaft, and then you put a jack under the front of the diff housing and hold it there while you undo this nut on the top here, and then by pushing on the front of the diff housing you will allow the bracket here to break off and be separated. Once you've got that done, you then have to take out the whole diff assembly of the car. You've then got to mark your crown wheel and pinion and then take the crown wheel out of the car, because the only way that you can get to the nut here is masked up by the crown wheel. So it's quite a complex job. So if you're going to have that done, don't complain when you find that the cost is rather prohibitive, because it does take time. But while you're at it, you'll also find that the leaks on the outside are also a problem. So while you've got the axles out, take the backing plates off, disconnect the handbrake, disconnect the hydraulic line coming to the diff, break the assembly at that side and take the whole back axle right out of the car. And then you can work on it properly. And it's the only way you can do it properly. The other thing you've got to worry about is when you do take it apart, you've got the right sort of tools to do it. Let's look at the ball joint sitting up on top of your diff housing. This is this whole assembly sitting here like this. The first thing you've got to do is, once you've got it out to this point, you can undo the wire circlip which is on here. Remove the wire circlip from there. Take your rubber bellows off the whole ball assembly. And when you get it apart, you'll find there's a little cup holder in here. And the reason for that is it sits down here in the base of your rubber grommet, and that has the spring come on top of it. So then you don't get any damage on the bottom. There's a cheating way of doing it if you're going. You turn around and break the assembly off here, and then you stretch this over the top of it. But once you get it over the top, you have to make sure that this little seal assembly in there is forced. You've got to lift it up and get it into the right position so as it'll house properly. You can do it, I've done it a number of times that way, but I have split them while I'm doing it as well. Just don't forget what you're doing. You're turning around and stretching the seal from there right across that whole face here. Now, to get it apart, there's 2 things. Joe Bloggs down the street, he turns around and he puts this in a vise. Oh, before you go any further, it's also got a wire circlip The wire circlip is on the ring here, and there's a hole drilled, and that goes in there to keep the two components together. Make sure you've taken that wire circlip out. It's hardened, and as sure as egg, if you break it, you'll never get it apart. It'll pick up and you won't get it out of it at all. To get it apart properly, I made up two tools. One which goes on here and holds on one section of it. The other tool you've got to have, it just doesn't work otherwise, is this one. I'll pass it around, you can have a quick look at it. And what it does, it allows you to undo the whole assembly . And you finish up with a housing, ball joint and two cups, which this one houses into this component here. Now, if you're going to do it at the same time, what I normally do is put this back in a lathe and I lap the two cups back to the ball joint, because if there's any wear on it, you can get the discrepancy out and then put it all back together. So what you've got then is this cup inside the housing here, this ball joint, and then the other cup going in there to hold it together. Now the big problem is that when you put it back together, when it goes back together, if it's too tight and you can't move it, what are you going to do? So you've got a range of shims which are available, just in my drawer, and these shims then go onto the section of the body here, and by being selective you can then get the required fit of the ball joint, so it's just a nice smooth movement with no free play whatsoever. Anybody wants to have a look at it? See what you've got in those? But once you've got it to that position and you've tightened it all up, you've then got to put that wire clip back in position. You might have to drill a new hole because it's gone into another area and your relocation is completely different. Okay? Once you've got that done, you put it all back together, do up your wire clip, put it back into the car and bob your uncle. You shouldn't have any leakage for some extended period of time. The club's had all these remade over the years. They're out of a really good material now. This one's extremely old, as you can see, and it's perished a bit inside and all the gunk from the sealant from years ago. So if you haven't got the tools though to undo that on your car, you really have some problems because you won't get it undone 9 times out of 10. They butcher them, they put Stilsons on the body, and then you can't do much with it. You've damaged the housings. Okay? That's the easy part of it. On the other side...
Sorry.
Yeah.
Question, are they on all Bristol screw 400
Yep.
on?
Yep.
Where is it leaking? It's leaking oil from the diff.
And what it leaks is it leaks from that. And the reason being, that's lubricated from your crown wheel. In your housing for your pinion assembly, there's a hole drilled which feeds up into that area. So as your crown wheel's spinning around, it's throwing heaps of oil back up into there. Then it's got a drain line also on the side. You can see the drain line on the cutaway on the taper. Yeah, so once you've done it right, you really don't have a lot of problems. You will have pinion seal leaks, where you could have flange seat or you could have a sump plug leak from the seal. But normally that's your biggest problem. And if you've got a lot of oil around your diff pinion assembly or your housing assembly, That's where it'll be coming from.
Does anyone just chuck that and put a modern seal ball joint on?
I wouldn't, because it's a beautifully made piece of equipment. It really is. I marvel at Bristol what they did. That their thought, the thought they put into manufacturing componentry is fantastic. And the only time you'll ever know there's a problem with a ball joint, if your car, you're taking off and stopping quickly, you hear clonk, 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 clonk on the ball joint. That's the only place it will come from that I know of. Yeah. Now, the other side of your car, where you've got the leaks coming up from just behind your backing plates or dropping down on the ground, comes from this area. What you've got, you have this, your suspension arm, which is sitting up here with the torsion bar through it, whatever is that way. So therefore, you have this assembly here, which is hanging off the back, and this part then sits into your diff itself, okay? So you've got to break this apart for a start. So to break it apart, you need a reasonably good puller, which is this thing here. So we've got the shaft like this, and then we've got a puller which goes in there so as to break that taper. You can use ordinary ones, but I like this one. I've done it same to the factory. That's done out of kite. It's a special steel. It's the hardest the hobs have held. And I also have a little adapter which goes over here, over the thread and the end of the shaft. Because if not, you can guarantee it's been broken by people putting ordinary pullers on there trying to get it apart, and it doesn't work. Right, once you've got that apart, this shield can come off out of the road, and then you've got this set up like this at present. This is still in your diff itself, in the housing. Now, to get it off, you've then got to take this cover off. If you don't take the cover off, it won't swing past the flange of the diff housing. That's how close it'll be. Now, remember now you've got this bronze bush in the diff housing itself. It's held in there by a thread. Then you can undo this, take it back out of the housing, and everything's clear. The first thing you've got to check then is what all the wear is on this shaft here, and you usually find it's quite bad. Over the years, the seals have probably gone quite hard and worn out, and you'll be getting leakage coming down past that as well. Down here on the front, you've got another cup protector or shield, rubber shield. Take that. And you're left with an assembly like this. To get it out, you've then got to push this back. Now, this will. This whole assembly is then held in by two screws on the side. And that can come out and you're left with this setup in your housing. If this is badly worn, years ago I had a chap called Halkies down at Williamstown, and he used to ceramic spray these or hard spray them and then grind them back. I found it better than hard chrome, and they wore extremely well. On your ball joint assembly here, you've then got another shaft which screws out of the housing. Inside the housing here, you've got a bronze bush, which is the location guide for this section here. Very seldom ever wears. I've never ever replaced one of these. I do cheat. What I do, I've got a special adapter I've got at home. I set this up in the press and I crush the bronze bush until I can just get it to go in, and so as I can turn it back in position. Now, to stop the leakage coming out of there, you have a rubber seal which goes into that housing, and then you've got a little ring which then goes over the top and pushes in. Now, to get that out when you're first playing around on your car, be extremely careful, because you can get the rubber out, but this ring is still sitting in there. You can see how fine it is, and if you try to do it, and I've got a special little tool to go inside and get in behind it, but if you hit it too hard, because this is all hardened, you'll break the corner off, and so that's the end of that one. So be extremely careful if you're putting it back together. That is a major problem. So how you go about putting it back together is this. Put it the right way, if you better, Colin. You put it back in, and what I do, I put it back until you are level at the face here. The reason for having this, you can actually move your wheels back and forward. And Bristol originally had a trammel which went under the front of the chassis cross member and then fed back and went into the centre of your rear axles. So you could transpose it to the other side and make sure that the wheels were exactly aligned for distance from the centre section of the chassis cross member. The trouble is, some people put it in there and then they're playing around and they keep winding and winding and forget where they've been, and they push the back end of this completely out. And Julian's got a good one at his place. He was going to drop it over and I didn't get it, but it's actually breaking it completely. Right, when you've got that all set up nice and nice, you've replaced your bush in the diff housing. There comes a problem once again. This is inch and 3/16, 1.38, 1.875. What I do, I set this up in the lathe, I measure this, I measure what the housing bore is, then calculate what the crush factor will be, then hope to God when I press it into the back of the housing again, I've got it right. If not, I've got an inch and 3/16 reamer that I then ream this out and then hope to God it's going to be nice and firm when it happens. But it will usually be too tight when you do it. The club has these spare parts, that's all okay. Now,
so this oil also comes from the diff.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. So, up in this housing here, when you're putting it back together, you've got a seal which fits into this housing here. When you put it in there, I'll let you pass it around. It's got a cutaway on. That's the one. It's got a cutaway there as well, so as when you're pushing it in, you're not going to damage it. Question: why did they put it on an angle? Anybody know? Bristol's very smart. If you look at the angle on the seal, the surface area of that seal is greater than the surface area on the shaft. So therefore, the retention is such that when that arm moves, rocking back and forward, if it's only a very minor movement, all it does is rock back and forward in the rubber itself. And so it doesn't wear anything out. It's not until you actually get movement that it starts to spin around on the actual bearing surface. And all the seals in Bristol stuff are like that in the suspension, even the front suspension, on the plates, the whole lot. That does leak when you've got problems there. When you have to put it all back together, you've now put the seal in here, you've done the other. You'll also notice there's got a hole on the ball joint here. That has now got to line up with a hole feeding the oil from your diff, because the oil in the diff now transfers across. When you go around a corner, the diff level is not that high that it's going to flood down here to your rear axle or your rear suspension. But when you're on an angle or go around a corner, you get feed across. It then goes across to here, feeds into the thread, down through the centre hole here, moves along. You've got a hole in the side here for your lubrication of the bearing, down through here, down into this housing and lines up with this hole down here and gives you your lubrication to feed around the half shells of the ball joint. When you've got that all together and lined to there, there's a cutaway in the side of the ball joint you probably noticed there. You've got to line that up with the holes, put your cup washer back in position, which will be hard now, that won't go back in. I've actually stoned these down so it would happen. Then you've got a bolt either side, a little stud to go in there, and that locks the ball joint in position. It's still got its movement. I haven't lined it up properly, unfortunately. Now your ball joint is held in position, but it's still got the movement. Now the next thing we've got to do is turn around and put the cap back on here. But hang on, there's a great big gap here, and that tighten that up, the ball joint's going to be locked. So now you've got to go back and find all these selective shims of these things and then put them back into the system here. I haven't set these up specifically either, I'm just showing it, that's all. They go in there, and then your cap can go back on. When you've got the selective movement of what you want, then you lock the whole thing up. Put a bit of gastric cement on the last little bit of it, and bob's your uncle from there. Takes time once again. I usually do exactly the same. I lap the ball joints and the half shells because you don't know what movement has been there, and it just picks it up so it's more even in its movement. Right, when you've got all that set up, you can turn around and put your rubber seal back on, which goes over to there. And then you have two circlips. You have a big circlip, which goes onto the section here, and you have a little circlip which goes here. Now, Joe Bloggs, who's pulled it apart before, this is covered in gunk and rubbish. He undoes the screws, the clamps that were on here, but he doesn't find these two little pieces of funny aluminium. And the reason for they are as such, they sit in there in the groove of the cup, and when you tighten it up, the rubber doesn't pucker up and allow the oil leakage to come apart. And as sure as eggs, they'll be missing. I didn't have one, I had to make one up to come here today actually. And then you have one for the small one which does exactly the same down here on the side. When you do put it back into the diff in the car, make sure that you lubricate this. I've used rubber grease on that rubber seal when I'm pushing it back in, and sometimes you'll even find it so hard to get it in, you can't get it started. I've had to pick it up, put the diff housing into the press, and then put this in the press and push it down to get the start and get it away. And once you get going, you'll be quite okay. Lubricate your threads as well, lubricate your ball joints before you fully assemble them, and it should be quite okay. When you go to put it back in the car and reconnect it to your suspension, make sure that you turn around, you have a good quality stone protector like this, which goes on to stop your rubber seal being damaged, and also put a very light smear of grease on the taper. You'll find it much easier, and you don't have to overload it to get it out. All the discussion regarding the distance of adjusting this is a little bit of hogwash as far as I'm concerned, because on the later Bristol they found it so expensive to do, they put a rubber bearing in here instead. So it was an overkill to the nth degree. And that's about it. Quite a simple job. Put it back in the car, put the diff back in the car, put the axle back in the car.
I'm convinced, Colin.
Nothing.
QED?
Yeah.
Would you complain bitterly if I grafted a 528 beam and diff in?
Any questions regarding it, or?
You're better off taking the dick out of the car to do it, or?
Yeah. Look, if you're going to do a work like this, there's only one way to do it. Take the whole diff assembly out of the car. You can clean it, paint it, do everything properly, put all your new gaskets in for your crown wheel and pinion carrier assembly, clean all the gunk and sludge out of it for a start, and you'll find you've got the benefit of doing it by a mile. It sounds horribly complicated, and for the average person it is, I know. To get the whole diff out of a car used to take me an hour and a half to drop it back on the ground. I don't undo the snubber straps. I take everything apart, get the backing plates off the car, and I found that I can slide it across from the snubber straps one way, turn around, pull the snubber strap back up, put it in a support, turn around, push it back the other way, and then slide it back on the ground. And I just did one recently, and I do it that way, and Julian was going to come over and give me a hand. I said, I've already done it this time. But you can do it labour. You can use your head how to do it if you just think about it at times. But the biggest thing is you've got to have the right tools.
And I gather that misshapen mess
It's
is
where
not
the
the right
Stilsons
tool.
pulled it out of the diff housing
Yes.
for the new one.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Could you just run through the oiling system again? Because
The diff or on the
Well-
lower ball joint.
perhaps both of them, I think.
Lubrication for this one. You'll notice there's a groove in here on this taper. What happens is the oil comes up from the crown wheel and pinion. There's a drilling there in the side which will come up and feed up into this ball joint area here. If it gets too much, it's got a drain line here which comes back and drains back out of the diff itself, out of the housing itself. So that's the reason these leak, because you've got a fair amount of oil being flung around. Well, you know, from anything that spins around got oil on it, it flings quite heavily. So that's where that goes. The other one, your oil's coming from your diff, from your diff housing, along through here, through this drilling, lubricating this thread, back into this drilling here, because you've got a cap on the end here normally. You've got a hole here in the bearing, or the bearing surface. The oil then comes back down here, drops down into the ball joint and lubricates the ball joint at the same time. Now this is always full of oil. So that's, if this leaks, you're just dropping on the ground. And there's plenty of Bristols around which have had diff problems, and the main diff problem is they've run out of oil in their diff,
Yes.
because this is where your oil's gone. And if you probably remember, Sue Burns was in Winton, and she left the motel and got to Winton, and the car seized on the side of the road, and there was no oil in the diff at all. It had gone. So, and it's not the first one that I've seen that's done that.
So the moral of the story is
Keep
check
your oil in
the
the diff.
oil in the diff.
Yeah,
It
but
doesn't-
if you are going to do it, look, if you ever get in the strife, come and talk to me. I'm quite willing to give a hand, even though I'm getting past the age of it all now. If you've got the right tools, you can do it. Most of my information now I'm passing on to Julian. Julian's now doing a lot of work, and I've passed on other equipment to him that I've had. Sometime down the track, if ever I decide to fall off the tree or something like that, I'll probably pass most of my stuff on to Julian anyway. I've got jigs and fixtures for every conceivable thing on the Bristol, and it's been an invaluable asset to me over the years.
And to the club members, thank you.
Yeah, it helps. Yeah. Okay, any other questions?
When you're taking the crown wheel out,
Yep.
you have to set the pinion up again, or is
No, if you the crown wheel is only held in by two caps, four bolts or four nuts. Always mark everything on the adjustment rings, so as you know you can put it back exactly where it is. Check your backlash at the same time, but I always glue the crown wheel and pinion teeth and make sure I have the right set, because if you don't, you've ruined your set on your crown wheel and pinion meshing. I recently had a crown wheel and pinion lapped up in Queensland, and it wasn't a very good one. Anyway, I set it up to the people up there. Bearing in mind, years ago we used to have a diff lapping people here in Richmond, diff specialist who was around here just in the back in Richmond, and they had a Hypoid Gleason lapping machine which was fantastic, and I had them make up all the adapters so as I could lap diffs there. And I went back there years later and they're gone. And I thought, what do I do now? And I found this guy in Queensland, and I rang him up and said, look, can you do these? And he said, yep. So I sent this crown wheel and pinion up to him, and he sent me a note back and said, look, he said, it is marked a bit, but I think I can save this one. And he did it. And what he did, when he sent it back to me, he gave me the backlash readings for it, and he also gave me all the markings in it. He didn't clean it after it had been lapped. So I had all the markings of where the mesh was exactly. And so I took photos of it, cleaned it all up, and the markings were still there a little bit, but I set the whole thing up exactly what I could see on that mesh with the exact backlash, and it was as quiet as a mouse. It was a really good setup. Yeah, I was very, very impressed with their work up there. And it wasn't particularly dear either. It was about $300, I think it was. And it was done in about a week and sent back to me.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's if you're going to do this part of it, you've got to take your crown wheel and pinion out. Yep. Okay,
Thank you very much, Colin. That was
Pleasure.
very informative.